Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack an absolutely incredible historical paradox. We are looking at a nation that history, despite its absolute best, most brutal efforts, simply couldn't erase. Over thousands of years, some of the greatest empires in the world marched right onto the Iranian plateau, swords drawn, absolutely certain they were going to wipe this civilization off the face of the earth forever. And yet, here they are. So let's dive right into this fascinating question. Think about it for a second. When contemporaries of early Iran suffered catastrophic blows, they permanently dissolved into the genetic and cultural melting pot of history, right? The mighty Babylonians? Gone. The Hittites? The Assyrians? Vanished forever. Yet the Iranians endured apocalyptic invasions time and time again. They lost on the battlefield, their capitals were literally burned to the ground, and they suffered through some brutal occupations, but somehow they survived.
And what's really fascinating is how we actually view the surviving entity today, because we have this stark, almost jarring split in our modern consciousness. Today, when you hear the word Iran, it probably triggers grim news reports, right? Images of geopolitical tension, harsh sanctions, and conflict. But the word Persia? Well, that still evokes this romantic, almost mythical aura of lost grandeur. We picture flying carpets, fairy tale empires, and refined poetry. We essentially have two completely different identities occupying the exact same plot of land.
Okay, moving on to the ultimate survival mechanism, taking us from 50,000 years ago all the way to global diplomacy. To really understand how these identities formed, we have to look at that ultimate survival mechanism. It's actually a massive historical injustice that we usually only credit Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt as the true cradles of civilization, because this region, it stands right shoulder to shoulder with them. Sometime between the 20th and 15th centuries BC, these nomadic tribes from the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus began descending onto this mountainous plateau. They called themselves Aryans, which meant noble, and they named their new homeland Arnem-Va, which, as you can probably guess, eventually morphed into Iran. And amazingly, their ancient Indo-Iranian language was a direct relative of Latin, Greek, and the languages spoken across Europe today, including English. Crazy, right? The sheer depth of history here is just staggering. 50,000 years ago, Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons were walking this land. 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, you already had complex urban settlements rising, like the Giraffe culture. But the truly mind-blowing milestone happens in the 23rd century BC. The state of Elam actually signed a written treaty with the Akkadian king. Just think about that for a moment. The Iranian space stood at the very origins of global diplomacy, creating the very first documented international treaty in all of human history. Which brings us to inventing linear time and a religion that literally rewrote human consciousness. So, in these harsh mountains and deserts, the primary weapon of the Iranians wasn't chariots, it wasn't bows, it was ideology. Long before Christianity or Islam, the Iranian plateau birthed the religion that turned human thought completely upside down, Zoroastrianism. For the ancient Iranian, life wasn't just some meaningless series of random accidents. No, the universe was an uncompromising, total war between Ahura Mazda, the transcendent god of light, truth, and order, and Ahriman, the spirit of absolute evil, lies, and darkness. To be Iranian meant you had to actively be a warrior of light. And this profound concept gave the entire nation a phenomenal, unshakable sense of unity. But the absolutely crucial takeaway here is the philosophical breakthrough Zoroastrianism brought to the world. They were the very first in history to declare that time does not just move in a cyclical circle of repeating seasons. Time is a linear path. It had a specific beginning at creation, and it's hurtling toward an inevitable end, with a final battle, a purification by fire, and a last judgment. When the Persians later liberated the Jews from Babylon, Jewish thinkers actually absorbed this concept of linear time and the end of days, laying the profound groundwork for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Next up, the first global superpower and the sheer, unmatched scale of the Achaemenid Empire. Armed with this incredible ideological unity, we arrive at the Achaemenid Empire. In 550 BC, Cyrus the Great, who was half Persian and half Mede, united his peoples to build history's very first superpower. And the scale of what he and his successor, Darius I, achieved is frankly hard to even wrap your head around. 50 million. At the peak of the empire, 50 million people lived under Persian rule. To put that into perspective, that was nearly half of the entire human population on Earth at that time, spanning all the way from Egypt to the Indus Valley. So, how exactly do you manage half the Earth's population? Well, unlike the tyrants of the past, Cyrus built his empire on respect.
He deliberately chose not to destroy local temples or enslave conquered populations. It was a total game changer. Darius I further innovated by dividing this massive land into 20 administrative districts, called satrapies. He introduced a unified tax system using gold Daric coins and laid down a massive road network that hosted the fastest state postal service in the entire world.
But history, as we know all too well, does not forgive weakness or overreach. Venturing into Central Asia to secure his empire from nomadic tribes, Cyrus the Great met a deeply brutal end. His army was completely annihilated by the Massageta tribe. Their leader, Queen Tomidris, seeking revenge for her own son, famously ordered her men to cut off Cyrus's head. She then threw it into a leather sack filled with human blood, delivering this chilling line, "You thirsted for blood? Now drink your fill." Despite that horrifying setback, the empire lived on and thrived. Now, look, we're all familiar with the epic story of the 300 Spartans, holding the line. But historically speaking, that's largely a Western myth. The Greeks absolutely defended their independence, for sure. But for a giant superpower like Persia, losing a couple of fringe cities was basically a mosquito bite. The Persians simply changed tactics. They just started funding Athens and Sparta against each other. By 387 BC, a totally exhausted Greece was forced to sign a humiliating treaty. Persia essentially bought Greece without firing a single shot. So, let's talk about devouring the conquerors and where this phoenix mechanism really kicks in. Because empires eventually stretch too thin, right? When the central government weakened, devastating forces from the outside finally broke through, building into this apocalyptic sequence. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great ruthlessly crushed the Persian army and burned their magnificent capital. Then, in 651 AD, after centuries of exhausting wars with Rome and Byzantium, the bleeding Sassanid Empire fell to the Arab Caliphate. And then, the true apocalypse. In 1220 AD, Genghis Khan's Mongols slaughtered entire cities and wiped out thousand-year-old irrigation systems. Literally, any one of these events should have permanently erased the Iranian identity from the map. But the Iranians did something completely inexplicable. They culturally digested their conquerors. It's like a superpower. Alexander's Hellenistic successors actually started wearing Persian clothes and adopting their court etiquette. The Arab caliphates brought Islam, sure, but they soon relied almost entirely on Persian bureaucrats and scholars, which allowed the Farsi language to outlive dozens of empires. And the fierce Mongols? Well, within just a few generations, they were building blue-domed Persian mosques, adopting Islam, and speaking Persian. The conquered East completely reprogrammed and swallowed the victorious West and the nomadic hordes. Which brings us to Persia becomes Iran, navigating modernity and the Great Game. Out of this constant spinning cycle of destruction and rebirth, the 16th century Safavid dynasty eventually reunited the country, making Shia Islam the state religion and culturally separating Iran from the Sunni Ottoman Empire forever. But by the 19th and early 20th centuries, this ancient giant was bleeding again. They suffered severe territorial losses to the Russian Empire, and by the eve of the First World War, Iran was reduced to a mere chessboard for the Great Game, literally carved into British and Russian spheres of influence. The country was suffocating under the weight of colonial powers, pumping its oil and dictating its future. But of course, Iran wouldn't be Iran if it didn't find a way to strike back and redefine itself. In 1925, Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power, charting a hard-line course for modernization. And then came the pivotal year of 1935. In 1935, Reza Shah issued a world-shaking directive to all global embassies. He demanded that the Western world stop calling the country Persia. That Greek word had become associated in Europe with backwardness, exoticism, and fairy tales. He insisted they use the ancient name the people had called themselves for millennia, Iran, the land of the Aryans. This wasn't just some whim. It was a powerful, defiant declaration of modern statehood. It was a demand to be taken seriously on the world stage, rather than viewed as an exotic colonial backdrop. And that brings us to the stunning historical paradox we live with today. Impartially speaking, whether looking through the lens of the Islamic Revolution of 1979 or the geopolitical headlines of the present, the struggle of this civilization continues. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Hidden behind the simple name of a country is a quiet, invisible war. A war between the romanticized Persia of the past, the complex and heavily scrutinized Iran of today, and how the world ultimately wants to see them. For 5,000 years, this culture has absorbed its conquerors, reshaped history, and refused to fade. Which legacy do you think will ultimately endure?